Well, thanks for coming back in again. You had an idea to develop your historic series now. You've given several very good interviews with us regarding the British soldiers who fought for the British side during the French and Indian Wars and also the American War of Independence. And you're bringing it a little bit closer to home for us on this side of the pond tonight. And
yes.
Yes, so you're speaking about Colonel John Gardiner. Now, my understanding, James, and could you just take this from the beginning, because this is like the 1745 Jacobite British conflict, and just kind of give us some background on what that conflict was about. That's the Gardiner chap right there.
Sure. So in brief, because I could go on forever about the 45, it's one of my hobby horses, so I'll try to keep this very truncated. Essentially, the Jacobite rebellions were dynastic conflicts for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to, I could go into everything, but essentially, James II was exiled from Britain, in large part due to his Catholic faith and because he was trying to essentially offer religious toleration for Catholics and various types of dissenting Protestants. And that ended up clashing with, various Anglicans and various other groups who didn't much like that. There were other elements involved, though, as well, because James, for example, was allied with France, versus people who were very, opposed to Louis XIV's expansions. And so you have eventually William of Orange and his wife, who's James's daughter, Mary II. They take the throne in what is known as the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And then subsequently, so they're Protestants, and so you have this, it's not a strict, it's complicated because it's not a strict religious divide in terms of who's on what side. So, for example, a lot of people think in their minds, so it's Catholic versus Protestant. Well, it's a little trickier than that because you have a lot of Protestants actually on the side of James and his descendants, who then come back to claim the throne in the Jacobite rebellions, Jacobite meaning essentially James supporters. And they would then support his son, James Francis Stuart, and then James Francis's son, Charles Edward Stuart, in their claims for the throne. So suffice to say, you had plenty of Protestants doing that, but at the same time, you had Catholic powers allied with William of Orange, for example, in his efforts to put a halt to Louis XIV's expansion. So when he went over and, did his essential bloodless coup conquest thing, it wasn't completely bloodless because of the battles that happened subsequently, but it's kind of remembered as bloodless. You had various Catholic powers actually, ironically, saying mass for him, and you even had the Holy See, so the Pope in Rome, kind of giving him the thumbs up because his lands were also in danger by Louis. So it was beneficial for all of them that William wins. So it was a complicated thing, is my point. So
yes,
fast forward, you got,
yeah, you find that in all wars that it might just seem it's like black v white or something, but there's actually lots of different groups have got their own particular interests in seeing one side dominate another side, which might be an interest that really has got nothing to do with even what seems to be the central conflict.
Exactly.
So that's just the nature of war.
Absolutely. And that was the case in each one of the subsequent Jacobite risings that occurred. So the one that we're focusing on currently because of Gardiner's role in it is the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, which is by far the most famous because it's the one that really is remembered through romantic storytelling and song. The last one that again, it's just commemorated in so many different ways that it Outlander has made it, very popular among some, viewers, for example, who may not be history buffs, but they will have watched that program and they'll remember it from there. But suffice to say, this is when Charles Edward Stuart, so Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender, called by those who were not as in favor of him, comes over to Scotland and tries to retake the triple crown, essentially, of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And so he has his uprising. He lands up in the north. He marches down through the Highlands. He collects support for himself, gets down to the lowlands, and he ends up taking Edinburgh, which was a rather largely Hanoverian city, actually. So Hanoverian being those pro the House of Hanover. So real quick, you basically have, after William and Mary die, they're succeeded by Mary's sister Anne. Then when she dies, the crown passes over to her Protestant cousins from Germany, the House of Hanover. So that's where you get the many Georges that come to power. And so at this point in time, so they're skipping over essentially the Catholic line. That's what they're doing. They're doing kind of a circumvention where it's like, we're not going to have you guys because you guys are Catholic, so we're going to give it to the Protestant distant cousins. So at this point in time, it's George the Second who is in command of this shebang when the 45 occurs and Charles Edward comes over and so forth. So basically, you do, though, and this is an important distinction, because this conflict has been so badly co-opted by nationalists that it is made into this England versus Scotland conflict a lot in popular culture, and that just simply was not the case whatsoever. You have many, many Scots who either were outright pro the House of Hanover, or they were neutral. You did, a minority, frankly, given all of that, were pro-Jacobite. So really, it isn't what it's set up to be. But so then this story here is a perfect case scenario for it, because tonight we'll be focusing on a Scottish gentleman who died fighting for the House of Hanover. And this is Colonel James Gardiner. So Gardiner started off his military career when he was very young, like when he was around 14 or so. And he served very briefly as a mercenary for the Dutch. And even though this would later go on to, like I mentioned when I did my episode on General Simon Fraser of Balnain, that mercenary service could be frowned upon, but it depended what time period you were in. So when it comes to Jacobites, or people from clans that were semi-Jacobite, or Highland clans or whatnot, or even split, like Fraser, they would use that against them, like, oh, they went and they served in mercenary capacity, and they would kind of use it as a negative. But you can see throughout history, plenty of people did stints in other armies in this time period, especially, and this is the case with Gardiner, and why he doesn't get any flack for this, is because this is the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution. And what is that about? It's about a Dutchman becoming the king of the Triple Kingdoms. So literally, serving in the Dutch army for a little while was no big deal in this capacity. So when he's very young, he serves for a year in the Dutch army, about a year and a half, something like that. And then he ends up serving under Queen Anne. So he goes, this is prior to the Act of Union, right? So in the War of Spanish Succession, everything is a little wibbly wobbly in terms of what is going to very, very shortly hereafter become the British Army proper. But so you have Scotsmen and Englishmen, though. I almost feel like it's fair to say that the British Union began with the military before it began with the parliaments, in a way. Because on a practical level, like in the War of Spanish Succession, you had the forming of the British Army before it was even officially formed, if you want to put it that way. You had Englishmen and Scotsmen, for example, working so closely together. So,
good point.
It was almost as if, like, the army under Marlborough practically was unifying even before the unification officially happened. Marlborough is a major figure in that, and we could do a whole episode on him separately because he's awesome, but that's another thing for another day. So suffice to say,
yeah, I'd like to do that. It just thinking about it, what you were saying there about the Scottish soldiers. There were Scottish soldiers fighting for Marlborough's army.
Oh yes,
and the Scottish Parliament, I made a Facebook post about this the other day. Actually, the Scottish Parliament said that they would take the soldiers out of Marlborough's army if the English Parliament at the time didn't allow a Scottish Act to be passed. But what was it? It was the Scots wanted their own act of settlement, but the English were like, no, we don't. We've decided it's going to be a Protestant, and the Scots were, yeah, we do want it to be a Protestant as well, but we want to be able to decide if we disagree with you. You know, if you pick the different one, we want another one if we don't like the one that you pick. And there was this big carry on about it, and the Scots were going to take the soldiers out of the Marlborough's army. And so the Queen Anne, or at least her governor, capitulated and said, okay, you get your way. You can have your particular act of security, as we called it. The English called it the act of settlement. We called it the act of security. Both essentially the same things,
right?
But yeah, that was all to do with the Scots in Marlborough's army being used.
Oh yeah, because it was a very trick. Because when you think about it, it's like, for example, the Earl of Stair. You know, he was essentially an aide of Marlborough, a very famous Scotsman. So this wasn't even just it wasn't just lower figure Scots. These were high ranking Scots who were in the army. Because when you look at it was a very interesting time. Like you said, it was very interesting because you have these various acts and assertions of, are we separate things completely, or are we kind of like meshing in some way, or how much are we meshing? What are we giving up? What aren't we giving up? Are we distinct? How long will we be completely distinct? Or are we ever completely distinct? Because like when you read even I was reading the Life and Letters of Samuel Rutherford recently, a very famous Presbyterian divine from the 1600s, from the era of the War of the Three Kingdoms. And this is a man who is referencing Britain as a whole very often. And so there was an understanding of it on some level, that they were all part of the same island and they were joined by fate in a certain way. They'd been joined by the crowns. Inevitably, they were joined by destiny, essentially. I mean, after a while, they were starting to refer to themselves as a single unit, even though there was these. So the point is, yes, all of this was going on at the same time. So you have Gardiner coming in on this, where he was part of a lot of Scots who were indeed serving in this military. You have it with the Covenanter Regiment, as I mentioned under Major Pitcairn's episode, that his dad was a chaplain for, that served under Marlborough, and all of this stuff. So it was very much on the cusp of the Union, I would say. These are like the final years, you might say, the final decade prior to when it finally kind of comes together. So it was a lot of different tugging going on of pros and cons, and what do we keep and what do we lose, and is it going to happen, and it's pulling for it happening, kind of thing. So anyway, Gardiner, he gets shot in the mouth at Ramillies. So he gets badly injured. This when he's like 15. He nearly gets killed by a scavenger. He gets rescued by a nun, of all things. And then, so he gets kind of patched up and taken care of. And she tries to convert him to Catholicism. But even though he has no interest in religion, he kind of has ethno-Protestantism going for him. So he's like, nah, thank you, no, but I'm not really religious, period. So then he goes on in life. He serves in various capacities, and he tends to live a fairly dissolute kind of early life, and just sort of likes the wine, women, and song going on about it. And then and is stationed in various parts of Europe during this time in his career. This is, again, post-Union at this point. So nowadays, officially, the British Army has come together as an entity. And so one of the most famous incidences that happens in his life is that when he is prepping essentially to meet up with this married woman in this romantic rendezvous. He is trying to kill some time while he's waiting for her. And so he ends up reading his book, which his pious mother packed him in his luggage, called The Christian Soldier by the Puritan divine Thomas Watson. And so he's reading this sort of again to pass the time. And then he, as he recorded it, saw this light fall on the pages, and he thought it was the taper sort of flaring on the sort of end table nearby. And then he turns and he has this dream vision type of thing of the crucified Christ, who says to him, "O sinner, have I suffered all this for thee, and these are the returns." So Gardiner gets very affected by this experience and turns around his life, becomes very pious, becomes famously pious figure, famously renowned in Presbyterian circles, was quite a sort of, it became like a source of emulation in Presbyterian circles this time. So he, very, very much is kind of dealing with the aftermath of that experience, kind of his whole life, you might say, because he continues to have and record these visions and ecstasies and dreams and so forth, and in his writings and so forth, as he's continuing his military career, which makes him a very fascinating character. He almost falls into this sort of type of the warrior mystic due to these things. So it's really interesting that way. And I'm just looking at my notes because there's a lot on Gardiner. Like, you could just go on forever on Gardiner. But
so bring us, we've got about 5 minutes or so. Bring us to the big battle then, that he is probably later in his career and is unfortunately the final one for him.
Sure. So as mentioned, he's a Hanoverian. He's a Presbyterian. He's serving in the regular army. And so he, for a long time, has sort of worried about this rebellion. He thinks the rebellion is going to happen, and he essentially believes that this is going to be kind of a chastisement on a sinful land. And so he talks a lot about having exhausted himself with strong cries and tears, which he poured out until he was hardly able to stand when he arose from his knees. And so he was foreshadowing that there was going to be bad things going to hit the country, and he believed it was sort of a chastisement on it. So, but he's determined essentially to, he basically says at one point, he thinks he's going to die. He kind of thinks he's going to die from the beginning. But he says he's willing to sacrifice himself for the security of the country, and he doesn't fear dying. He doesn't fear fighting. He only fears sinning. So this was his famous line. He goes into it, and he serves under Sir John Cope. So he becomes famous for "Hey Johnny Cope, Where You Walking Yet" song. Poor Cope. I could get a whole thing on him too. I feel a little bit bad for him. I think he gets a bit harshly treated. But shall we just say Gardiner and Cope didn't really see eye to eye on how to do how to combat the Jacobite threat. They didn't see eye to eye. Gardiner really does feel like Cope isn't handling it right when they're going toward Prestonpans. So effectively, Prestonpans, it was a great Jacobite victory. It was a big Jacobite high, and the floor gets kind of wiped with, Team Hanover. And so Cope does try to rally his troops, and he famously tells them, tries to rally them saying, "Behave like Britons," and so forth. And, but everybody was kind of freaked because they're being the recipients of the Highland charge. And that was pretty terrifying. And I mean, this is worth another mention that, Lowlanders were actually more likely to dread and be afraid of Highlanders than the English. Like when we think about the English versus the Scots, we have this cartoonish version of what Scotland was, and they're all Highlanders technically. Like the Lowlanders were a different group of people. They were just different, and they felt very different to their Highland, counterparts who were different in many, many ways. Language, oftentimes religion, they tended to be more Catholic and Scottish Episcopalian, whereas the Lowlanders tended to be more Presbyterian. That could vary, obviously, but that's generally speaking. And in dress, in manners, in culture, in what they felt comfortable doing in terms of casual violence. So there was a lot of different things, and the Highlanders were terrifying. They were totally terrifying, especially the Lowlanders. Just freaked the heck out by these people. So Gardiner, though, because he's pretty awesome himself, is kind of like, all right, we're being, attacked by Highlanders and they're freaking terrifying, but we're gonna hold we're gonna hold together here. So Gardiner, as it says, Gardiner fought and fighting fell, and so essentially he would not get off the field. He would refuse to get off the field. He kept fighting until he was shot roughly 4 times and then hit in the head with a Lochaber axe. Because did we ever mention in this series of Scottish soldiers I've been presenting, Scots can't just die. These guys cannot just die. They need to have something extra happen before they can die. So all this happens to him, and he should be dead. He's not, though. So you basically have his manservant eventually finds him, prostrate under a thorn tree. Which becomes this whole, allegorical and religiously symbolic thing. And so then he ends up taken to essentially a church manse where he is nursed, rather ironically, by 2 Jacobite sympathizing young ladies, not terribly far from his own home. He was married with many children himself. Makes it rather tragic. But he was quite close. It was his own turf. He was a lowland Scot, and he was very near to the place where this thing was fought. And so he dies there. And that's where, you basically have the monument that is there to him currently.
Yes, we've got a picture here at Bankton House in Prestonpans. There is a memorial to him, and there it is there. And I don't know to what extent you can see it from the picture, but there's 4 sleeping lions at each of the 4 corners of that obelisk, and I had not been aware of it until researching the matter. I had not been aware of this man until today, actually.
A bit tragic, because he was, quite a famous figure, at the time, for sure. And I actually had him included in my American Revolution novel by way of Major John Pitcairn telling his story, because Pitcairn came from the same general area of Scotland, comes from this very strong Presbyterian family, his dad being, a Covenanter style moderator and so forth. So I had him just tell the tale, because I really wanted to, get it in there. And he was such a famous figure at the time.
So that's presumably him in this picture here.
It is, yes. Being awesome. And
I wouldn't like to be stuck in the middle of that.
I know we're running low on time, so what I'll do is quickly just read a quote from him, and a quote from the book he was reading. So Gardiner was fairly prolific. Anybody who wants to look up his stuff, I highly recommend it. Quite a good read to get a sense of the era, both as a military man, but also the religious tone of the era for especially like pious Presbyterians, but also just in general Christianity of the era and its expression in the British Isles. Highly recommend it. So like track down his letters by all means. Just type it in. Google has them there for free. But anyway, I'll just read 2 bits. I know we're running out. So this is from him. I think I can bear anything, the loss of all, the loss of health, of relations, on whom I depend and whom I love, all that is dear to me without repining or murmuring. When I think that God orders, disposes, and manages all things according to the counsel of his own will, when I think of the extent of his providences, that it reaches to the minutest things, then, though a useful friend or dear relative be snatched away by death, I recall myself and check my thoughts with these considerations. Is he not God from everlasting and to everlasting? And has he not promised to be a God to me, a God in all his attributes, a God in all his persons, a God in all his creatures? and providences. And this was immediately before Prestonpans, this line he was writing to a friend, when he still, nothing bad had happened yet. But he was saying, I have been very busy, hurried about from place to place. But blessed be God, all is over without bloodshed. And pray let me ask, what made you show so much concern for me in your last? Were you afraid I should get to heaven before you? Or can any evil befall those who are followers of that which is good? And then lastly, this is from the book he was reading when he had his fateful epiphany conversion moment, from Thomas Watson, again, the Puritan divine, who's also a very fascinating character from out of British religious literature. But it sums up Gardiner extremely well, I think, and would go on to define everything about him going forward from that point. A Christian fights the Lord's battles. He is Christ's ensign bearer. Now, what though he endures hard fate and the bullets fly around? He fights for a crown. And this ties in very much from the legend that when Gardiner was laying on the ground mortally wounded, some Jacobites were around him, and Gardiner essentially says, you've come here to fight for your prince, or something like that. Your prince has come here to fight for your crown. Well, I have already gained a crown. So that kind of ties in, and the thorn tree also ties in with the imagery of crowns as well in Christian martyrology tradition. So well, that was Gardiner, and that is his legacy in that.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to fire his name up here for people. James Gardiner.
Yeah, Gardiner. This one says Gardiner.
Does it? Oh, Gardiner. That's fire. I fired it up too quickly.
It's James and then Gardiner.
Yeah, that's my hay fever. Sorry.
No worries. I live on a farm, you see. So why should we be cowed by mere hay when we have predecessors uncowed by bullets? No, hay is worse than bullets. We should be cowed by it. If there's anything we should be cowed by, it's hay.
Avellina, you've been very entertaining tonight. Thanks very much for introducing us to another lost Scotsman that many of us had never heard about, and who's famous enough to have his own memorial as well.
The lost shall be found.
That's right. Anybody wants to find out more about you, go to your youtube.com/@Avellina Balestri. That's AVELLINA BALESTRI for the benefit of those listening on audio only. And we'll have you back. And there's countless people. Johnny Cope, you mentioned there. Marlborough, yeah. Crikey, he could take up several issues.
Here's a thought I have. I think it would be fun to do Sir Hugh Mackay, because he's in the same realm of the general Glorious Revolution Jacobite period, and he's also a Scotsman who served with the Dutch a bit. And so I think it would be fun to do him as follow-up.
Let's do it. We'll make a date for sometime later this year or whenever suits your fancy, Avellina. But in the meantime, have a lovely afternoon over there in Maryland. And thanks once again for coming back on.
Thank you for having me on. God bless. Thank you.
You're welcome.